The biting winds of the north do not merely blow. They carve across the vast, untamed expanse of the pre-colonial American wilderness. Winter was not simply a season. It was a relentless adversary. A formidable presence that demanded respect, preparation, and an almost intuitive understanding of the natural world. To the indigenous peoples who called these frost-laden landscapes home, the onset of winter was a rhythmic transition, a time when the feverish pace of the harvest surrendered to the profound, hushed stillness of the ice. Imagine, if you will, the sensory experience of a mid-winter evening in the Great Lakes region centuries ago. The sun, a pale distant coin, dipped below the horizon long before the day's work was truly done, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and charcoal grey. The air was so cold it felt brittle, a tangible weight that stung the lungs with every inhalation. Yet, amid this crystalline silence, there was no panic. There was instead a profound sense of order. For generations, these communities had mastered the art of living in harmony with the cycle of the frost. Their survival was not a product of luck, but the outcome of a complex, sophisticated body of knowledge passed down through the fireside stories of elders, a legacy of observation that turned the hostile landscape into functioning home. We often view history through the lens of our modern comforts, the immediate warmth of a thermostat, the thick synthetic insulation of contemporary jackets, the safety of stone-walled, draft-free rooms. To understand the reality of indigenous survival, we must first strip away these layers of modern reliance. We must consider a world where heat was a labour, a tangible resource that had to be hunted, gathered, and carefully husbanded. The challenge of the cold was not just about finding shelter, it was about the daily negotiation with the elements. It was about how to position a structure to capture the weak winter sun, how to manipulate the ventilation of an interior fire, and how to harness the thermal mass of the earth itself to hold on to the fleeting warmth of the day. The indigenous approach to the cold was fundamentally rooted in the philosophy of stewardship and adaptation. Unlike the encroaching European settlers, who often sought to impose their architectural will upon the land building, structures that fought against the local climate, the native inhabitant built structures that worked with it. They were masters of thermodynamic. Long before the word existed, they understood the properties of cedar, birch, and earth. They understood the physics of how smoke rises and where heat lingers. This documentary seeks to explore this profound intellectual heritage. We will walk through the construction of their dwellings, examine the genius of their hearths, and delve into the social structures that turned the winter from a season of peril into time of community, reflection, and artistic development. As we journey through this landscape, keep in mind that the stories we are unfolding are not mere anecdotes of historical survival. They are reflections of a deep, symbiotic relationship with the environment. Every design choice, from the curve of a wigwam to the placement of a village within the protective embrace of a valley, was an expression of cultural identity and resilience. It is an invitation to look at the landscape not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a teacher to be respected. The history of how these communities stayed warm is a testament to the fact that when humanity aligns its ingenuity with the patterns of the natural world, the result is not just survival, but enduring, vibrant, and deeply human culture. The channel Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To truly grasp the ingenuity of indigenous thermal management, we must first deconstruct the architecture of the dwelling. When we look at the iconic structures of the northeastern Great Lakes, the wigwam and the longhouse, we are not simply looking at houses, we are looking at sophisticated thermodynamic envelopes. These were not primitive shelters thrown together in haste, but carefully engineered machines designed to trap warmth, repel the biting wind, and manage the constant flow of air required to sustain life and fire within. The beauty of the wigwam, for instance, lies in its geometry. It is a dome, a shape that nature itself favours for efficiency. By utilising a circular or oval footprint, the indigenous builds minimise the surface area exposed to the freezing exterior. This is a fundamental principle of heat conservation. A sphere has the least amount of surface area for a given volume, and a dome is the closest approximation to this ideal that can be constructed with flexible local materials. The saplings of birch or elm, bent with rhythmic precision into arches, provide a resilient skeleton. This structure was designed to withstand the weight of heavy insulating snow, the very snow that, once accumulated on the exterior, acted as a second, thick layer of insulation, sealing gaps and keeping the internal environment stable. But the real secret of these structures was in the layers. The outer covering was rarely a single, uniform sheet. It was a complex system of overlapping mats, fashioned from birch bark, reed, or animal hides. These materials were chosen not just for their availability, but for their specific properties. Birch bark, for example, is remarkably waterproof and durable, acting as a primary shield against moisture. Beneath this outer skin, a secondary layer of woven grass or cattle mats served as an air trap. By creating a dead air space between the inner and outer layers, the inhabitants were creating a natural equivalent to modern double, pane windows or wall insulation. This trapped layer of air acted as a thermal buffer, preventing the rapid dissipation of heat from the inside to the outside, even when the wind howled with 0-degree fury. Ventilation was another area of supreme mastery. The challenge of any fire-based heating system and enclosed space is the management of smoke and the constant need for fresh oxygen. A house that is too tightly sealed becomes a death trap of smoke inhalation. A house that is too drafty loses its hard, earned warmth in moments. The indigenous solution was an elegant integration of design and function. The smoke hole, situated at the apex of the dome or along the ridge of a long house, was not merely an opening, it was the engine of the home's ventilation. By carefully managing the height of the walls and the pitch of the roof, they encourage a constant, gentle flow of air that pulled fresh oxygen in from the lower, smaller vents while allowing the hot smoke, laden air to rise and escape through the top. It is a humbling realization to consider that this level of engineering was achieved without a single blueprint, relying instead on a collective architectural memory and an intimate knowledge of the properties of local timber and flora. The builds understood how to use the seams of the construction to their advantage, often orienting the entrance away from the prevailing winter winds. In many cases, a secondary windbreak or a small shielded foyer was constructed, a clever adaptation that prevented a direct blast of Arctic air from hitting the central living area whenever someone stepped outside. Every aspect of the house was a conscious response to the environment, a testament to a people who treated their home not as a separate entity from nature, but as an extension of the forest itself. These structures were organic, breathing, and remarkably effective at maintaining a habitable climate in the depths of the harshest winters known to the North American continent. In the heart of every longhouse or wigwam, there sat a focal point that defined existence, the hearth. To the modern observer, a fire is often a decorative element, a flicker of light at the end of a long day. But in the frozen wilderness of pre-colonial North America, The hearth was the literal engine of survival. A sacred technology that required constant attention, profound respect, and extraordinary level of precision. It was the centerpiece around which family life, social organization, and the very rhythms of the day were calibrated. The mastery of fire was not merely about ignition, it was about the control of combustion. Consider the fuel itself. Indigenous knowledge of wood types was exhaustive. They understood that not all heat is created equal. For a long, slow, burning fire that could sustain the warmth of a dwelling through the night, they sought the dense, slow, assuming heartwoods of oak, maple, or hickory. These woods provided a consistent, radiant heat without the explosive popping or excessive sparks that could prove hazardous in an enclosed, bark-covered structure. Conversely, for quick warmth in the morning or for specific tasks like cooking, they utilized softer woods, which offered a rapid, intense heat. This wasn't just foraging, it was a sophisticated management of resources, ensuring that the labor expended in gathering firewood was matched by the efficiency of the heat produced. The construction of the hearth itself was a masterpiece of safety and thermal efficiency. Often it was raised on a platform of hardened clay or a ring of selected stones, which served two critical purposes. First, it insulated the fire from the cold, damp ground, preventing the heat from being wicked away by the frozen earth beneath the home. Second, the thermal mass of the stones or clay acted as a battery. Throughout the day, as the fire burned, the stones absorbed the heat, radiating it long after the flames had been dampened or died down to embers. This is a principle we now call thermal mass storage, yet it was a fundamental, intuitive part of indigenous domestic engineering. The relationship between the fire and the occupants was one of proximity and careful arrangement. Sleeping platforms were often elevated, typically along the perimeter of the structure. By sleeping on raised benches or platforms, sometimes insulated with layers of woven mats and heavy furs, the occupants took advantage of the fact that heat rises. They positioned them in the comfort zone, where the rising warmth was most intense, yet safely removed from the direct flame. This arrangement also kept them away from the cold drafts that naturally crept along the floor level. It was an ergonomic layout designed to maximize human comfort in a space that would be considered impossibly cold by modern standards. Safety was an ever-present concern, and it was addressed through rigid social protocols and ingenious physical designs. The hearth was always located directly beneath the central smoke aperture, which acted as a chimney. By maintaining a specific controlled size for the fire, the inhabitants ensured that the smoke would rise in a concentrated column straight out of the roof, rather than billowing in the living space. This required a constant, vigilant monitoring of the flame. It meant that someone was always attuned to the state of the fire, feeding it, checking the airflow, and ensuring that the embers remained stable. This constant stewardship of the hearth created a sense of stability and predictability, turning the potentially wild and dangerous element of fire into a reliable life-sustaining partner. The hearth, in this sense, was the height of the family unit, a warm, constant pulse that shielded them from the absolute zero of the outside world. While the architecture provided a shield against the elements, the most intimate layer of protection was, quite literally, the clothing worn by each individual. To survive a winter where temperatures plummeted far below freezing, one could not rely on bulk alone. The indigenous approach to winter attire was a masterclass in layering, material science, and the intelligent use of biological insulation. Every garment, from the moccasins on the feet to the robes draped over the shoulders, was engineered to manage moisture. retain body heat, and allow for the physical exertion required for hunting and travel. The primary material of choice was the hide of the deer, elk, or moose, meticulously processed through a long, labor-intensive method of tanning that utilized animal brains and smoke. This process resulted in a leather that was not only incredibly durable but also soft, pliable, and resistant to the drying and cracking effects of extreme cold. Unlike modern synthetic fabrics that can become stiff or brittle in sub-zero weather, properly tanned brain, tanned leather, maintained its integrity and flexibility, allowing for the freedom of movement essential for the survival of the individual. However, the leather itself was merely the shell. The true warmth came from the strategic use of fur. Beaver, bear, wolf, and rabbit pelts were harvested and fashioned into winter garments, with the orientation of the fur being of critical importance. For the inner layers, the fur was worn against the skin, where the dense undercoat of the animal could trap a layer of warm, stagnant air, the same principle of insulation that allowed the animal to survive the winter in the wild. This trapped air acted as a thermal barrier, far more effective than any heavy wool coat of the period. The outer layers, often worn with the fur facing outward, served to shed snow and wind, while the leather side provided a secondary windproof barrier. Moccasins were a particular marvel of indigenous ingenuity. They were not merely footwear. They were sophisticated insulators designed for the specific environment of the snow forest floor. A well-constructed winter moccasin featured a double layer, an outer shell of sturdy leather and an inner liner of soft fur-lined hide. Between these layers one might find dried moss or grass, which served as exceptional moisture, wicking material. This was a crucial detail. Sweat, if allowed to freeze against the skin, was a silent killer in the winter. By incorporating materials like dried moss, which had high absorbency, the indigenous people could keep their feet dry and warm, preventing the onset of frostbite even during long treks through the deep, drifting snow. The garments were also loose, fitting, a design choice that is vital for thermal regulation. Tight clothing restricts blood flow, which is the body's natural heating system. By allowing for a generous fit, these garments ensured the blood could circulate freely to the extremities, carrying heat to the fingers, toes, and face. Accessories like mittens and head coverings were often attached to the main garment with cords or woven bands, ensuring that nothing was lost and that no part of the body was exposed to the biting wind for longer than necessary. This was a holistic system of dress, where each piece played a specific role in the complex, ongoing battle against the cold. It was a testament to a deep empirical understanding of how the human body interacts with the environment, honed through generations of trial and error in one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. Beyond the physical fortifications of the home and the personal layers of fur, there existed a far more subtle, yet powerful, technology of survival, the strength of the community. In the depths of the long winter, when the world outside was silent by a thick blanket of ice and the hours of darkness far outnumbered the fleeting moments of daylight, the survival of the individual was inextricably linked to the cohesion of the group. The indigenous social structure was not merely a way of organizing labor, it was a psychological and physical survival mechanism that leveraged the collective heat and wisdom of the people to endure the season of scarcity. One of the most remarkable aspects of this communal survival was a strategic densification of their living arrangements. During the peak of winter, smaller family units would often consolidate into larger communal dwellings. This was not simply for social convenience, it was a brilliant adaptation to the thermodynamics of the climate. By sharing a single larger structure, the community could maintain a consistent shared hearth, reducing the total amount of fuel required per capita and creating a stable temperate microclimate that was easier to manage than dozens of separate, smaller dwellings. The ambient heat generated by the presence of multiple bodies in a shared space was a literal force of nature, keeping the interior temperature significantly higher than it would have been if individuals were scattered. The role of the elders in this communal setting cannot be overstated. During these long confined months, they became the keepers of the oral tradition, their stories acting as the binding agent of the society. Through the recounting of legends, histories, and lessons, they maintained the morale and the collective focus of the group. This was vital. In a survival situation, the psychological toll of isolation and the monotony of the cold could be just as dangerous as the physical threat of frostbite. The storytelling sessions provided a sense of purpose and continuity, reminding everyone that this, too, was a season that would eventually pass, as it had for countless generations before them. It transformed the winter from a time of endurance into a time of cultural transmission. Moreover, the division of labour was orchestrated with a focus on communal well-being. Everyone had a role to play, from the gathering and preparation of wood to the ongoing maintenance of the winter stores, which were meticulously managed to ensure that no one suffered from hunger, which would, in turn, compromise their ability to regulate their body temperature. They understood that a well-nourished body was far better equipped to produce and retain heat. The system was one of absolute mutual reliance. In this frozen world, selfishness was a luxury that could not be afforded. The survival of the one was seen as the success of the whole, and the communal hearth served as the visible symbol of this enduring commitment to each other's life. If you find yourself moved by the resilience and ingenuity of these ancient communities, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue exploring the fascinating, often untold stories of how humanity has thrived in harmony with nature throughout history. We invite you to join our community in the comments section. What aspects of this ancient wisdom do you find most applicable to our understanding of human connection today? Share your thoughts below, and let us continue this historical journey together. When the autumn leaves had finally fallen, and the first thin skin of ice began to form on the edges of the ponds, the time for transition had arrived. In the communities we are exploring, this wasn't a moment of uncertainty. It was a scheduled, coordinated migration. For the rest of the year, they might have lived in more open, breezy locations, near the water for fishing or on the plains for seasonal agriculture, but winter demanded a different set of priorities. Survival now depended on finding a wintering ground, a place where the landscape itself acted as the first line of defence against the freezing wind. Selecting this site was a task that required an almost scientific understanding of local topography. They looked for hollows or valleys that were protected by high, forested ridges on the windward side. If you were to walk into one of these spots on a blustery day, you would notice the change immediately. The roar of the wind at the top of the ridge softened into gentle rustle among the branches below. By positioning their shelters in these natural basins, they effectively voided the wind chill factor, which is the primary cause of rapid heat loss in the winter. They also favored specific types of vegetation. A forest dominated by evergreens, pines, spruces, and hemlocks was far more desirable for a winter camp than a forest of deciduous trees like oak or maple. The reason is simple. Evergreens keep their needles. A dense canopy of evergreens acts like a roof over the entire camp, trapping a layer of still, slight warmer air beneath the boughs and preventing heavy snowfall from piling up directly around the living spaces. This meant that the paths between dwellings remained easier to manage, and the wood used for building remained drier for longer. Water was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. They need a source that was close enough to be accessible, but far enough away that the humidity from open water wouldn't make the air inside their homes feel damp and bone, chilling. They looked for springs or streams that were less likely to freeze solid. A frozen, stagnant pool was useless, but a flowing spring offered a lifeline. Once the site was chosen, the organization of the camp followed a very logical, established pattern. Shelters were built in a configuration that minimized the distance between families, which not only helped with social cohesion, but also allowed them to manage a communal fire and share the labor of clearing snow. Everything was done with a focus on conservation of calories, conservation of warmth, and conservation of effort. They didn't build more than they needed, and they didn't waste energy on unnecessary tasks. The move to the wintering ground was a quiet, orderly fare, a rhythmic shifting of people and resource from the place of summer expansion to the place of winter consolidation. It was a lifestyle built on the understanding that to thrive in a land of extreme seasons, one must not fight the landscape, but learn to live within its protective folds. If the shelter was the shield against the cold, then food was the fuel that kept the internal fire burning. Surviving a winter that could last for 5 or 6 months required a level of foresight that is difficult for us to imagine today. When the temperature drops, the human body burns a significantly higher amount of energy just to maintain its core temperature. This meant that the larder, the collection of stored resources, had to be dense, reliable, and expertly preserved. This wasn't just about avoiding hunger. It was about metabolic survival. The process of building this winter store began long before the first frost. Throughout the summer and early autumn, the community was in a constant, organized state of harvest. They gathered nuts, seeds, berries, and roots, but the most critical component for winter thermoregulation was protein and fat. Meat, specifically from deer, elk, or smaller game, was processed with extreme care. The method most commonly used was drying, stripping the meat into thin slices and expose it to a combination of sun, air, and the gentle curing smoke of a fire. The smoke was key. It didn't just dry the meat. It acted as absorbing the surface in compounds that deterred insects and slowed the growth of bacteria. This jerky, as it is often called, was incredibly nutrient-dense. A small pouch of dried meat contained the caloric equivalent of a much larger fresh meal, making it ideal for the limited storage space they had. But they didn't stop there. They also rendered animal fat or tallow into solid bricks. This fat was in essence pure energy. It could be added to soups, mixed with dried berries and pounded meat to create a long-lasting portable food known as pemmican, or used as a base for medicinal salves. Storage locations were just as important as the preparation. They used underground pits lined with bark stones or woven mats to keep the contents dry and insulated from the frozen soil. These pits were essentially early, natural refrigerators, By digging below the frost line, they ensured that the food remained at a stable, cool temperature. Some communities also used raised platforms or caches high off the ground to keep their stores safe from scavenging animals like bears or wolverines, which were also looking for high-calorie meals during the lean months. The management of these stores was a communal responsibility. Because individual survival depended on the health of the entire group, the winter larder was never the property of one person. It was a shared resource, carefully rationed to ensure that everyone, from the children to the elders, maintained the body mass necessary to handle the stress of the cold. They knew exactly how much food was needed to get through the expected duration of the winter with a buffer for the inevitable late-season storms. This meticulous counting was the difference between a winter of relative comfort and a winter of desperate struggle. It was a testament to their patience. In a world without supermarkets, the winter larder was the physical evidence of their hard work, their planning, and their deep-seated commitment to the endurance of their people. In a world where your home is kept comfortable solely by the flame in the center of the room, firewood is more valuable than gold. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire rhythm of winter survival revolved around the hearth, but not all wood burns the same, and the indigenous communities knew this better than anyone. They had a deep, practical knowledge of the forest, recognized that each tree species offered a different kind of energy, and selecting the right wood for the right time was a daily survival skill. For the long, dark nights, heavy hardwoods, oak, maple, beech, or hickory, these woods are what we might call slow burners. When you place a seasoned log of oak on the fire, it doesn't just flare up and disappear. Instead, it slowly transforms into a glowing bed of coals. These coals are the secret to staying warm until dawn. They radiate a steady, consistent heat for hours, long after the visible flames have died down. By banking these coals, covering them with a little bit of ash to slow their consumption, the fire could be kept alive through the entire night without needing constant attention. This allowed the family to sleep, knowing that the source of their warmth was stable and reliable. During the day, when the household was active, they used a different approach. They would often mix in lighter, faster, burning woods like birch or pine. These woods light up quickly and produce a burst of intense heat, which was perfect for cooking a quick meal or taking the chill out of the air after a cold morning. However, they also had to be careful. Woods or throw-off sparks were avoided for indoor use, as a stray spark could easily ignite the dry mats or furs that made up their bedding. They preferred woods that burned clean, without excessive popping, which was a sign of a well-seasoned, dry log. The gathering of this wood was a massive, communal task that began in the late summer. They would hunt for standing dead wood, trees that had died naturally but remained standing. Because these trees were no longer drawing moisture from the ground, they were already partially seasoned by the wind and sun. Hauling this wood back to the camp was hard, physical labor, but it was an investment in the coming months. They would stack it neatly, protected from the snow, ensuring a steady supply that was ready to burn the moment it was needed. This wasn't just about heat, it was about efficiency. By knowing exactly which branch would burn the longest, or which log would provide the best coals for baking, they eliminated waste. Every trip in the woods for more fuel was energy expended, so they made sure each log counted. This level of intimacy with their environment, understanding the weight, the density, and the burning qualities of every type of tree in their vicinity, was a fundamental part of their resilience. If you are finding these insights into the practical history of survival helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives in the lives of those who came before us. We're building a community of history enthusiasts here, and your interaction helps us keep these stories alive. What do you think would be the most difficult part of managing a home like this? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one of them. If you have ever tried to walk through knee-deep powdery snow, you know the feeling of frustration as your legs sink with every single step. In the vast open forests and plains of North America, this sinking wasn't just an annoyance, it was a life-threatening waste of energy. To hunt, to gather, or to visit a neighbouring camp during the winter, one needed to stay on top of the snow, and the solution was the snowshoe. This was not a modern invention of sporting gear. It was an essential piece of trans-spacey technology that allowed indigenous communities to traverse distance that would otherwise be impassable. The construction of a pair of snowshoes began with a selection of the right wood, usually ash, due to its incredible combination of strength and flexibility. The wood had to be green, freshly cut, so it be bent into the characteristic teardrop or oval shape without snapping. The frame was carefully shaped, steamed over a fire to soften the fibres, and then bent around a jig or a tree trunk to set the curve. Once the frame was lashed together at the toe and heel, it became a rigid but lightweight perimeter that would provide the necessary surface area to support a person's weight on the surface of the snow. The webbing, the part that actually keeps you afloat, was a masterclass in weaving. They used narrow strips of animal hide, usually from deer or moose. These strips were soaked until they were pliable and then woven in a tight lattice pattern across the frame. As the hide dried, it would naturally shrink and tighten, creating a surface as taut as a drum. This tension was crucial. It meant that the snowshoe would not sag under the weight of the person walking, but instead, it would distribute that weight over a wide area, allowing the user to float on top of even the softest, freshest powder. The size and shape of the shoe were tailored to the terrain. For dense, wooded forests, they built shorter, wider shoes that were easier to move around trees and through thick brush. For the wide, open plains, they built longer, narrow shoes, which were designed for speed and covering ground in a straight line. Every pair was a custom fit, designed for the specific body weight and the specific type of travel required by the individual. It wasn't just a generic tool, it was an extension of the person's own movement. Learning to walk in them was a skill in itself. It required a rhythmic, slightly wider gait to ensure the frames didn't tangle with one another. Once mastered, however, it changed the winter from a season of containment into a season of mobility. It meant they could reach hunting grounds that were a mile away, check traps that would otherwise be unreachable, and maintain the vital social connections between distant camps. The snowshoe was a triumph of design, simple, elegant, and perfectly suited to the environment. It demonstrated that by observing the physical properties of weight distribution, these early engineers had mastered the ability to move through a landscape that would have stopped anyone else in their tracks. When you step inside a winter dwelling, the first thing that strikes you isn't the heat, it's the organization of space. In a structure designed for survival, there is no wasted room and no accidental layout. Every square inch of the floor plan is calculated to manage the flow of cold air and maximize the retention of heat. The way they arranged their sleeping quarters was a direct application of their understanding of thermodynamics, specifically how to avoid the cold sink of the ground. The ground in midwinter is a heat thief. Even inside a bark-covered structure, The frozen earth beneath the floor would sap warmth from a body faster than the air itself. To solve this, they created raised platforms, often running along the perimeter of the interior. These were not just benches, they were layered thermal insulators. The base was constructed of logs or sturdy saplings, elevated several inches above the ground to allow for air circulation. This separation was the first defense. By lifting their sleeping area above the floor, they stayed out of the cold, dense air that naturally settled at the lowest point of the room. On top of this frame they built layers. First came a thick padding of evergreen boughs, hemlock or pine, which served as a springy, insulating mattress. The needles of these trees trap tiny pockets of air, which is the most effective way to block the cold from moving upward. Over this they laid woven reed or grass mats, followed by the most important layer, heavy fur-lined hides. The fur was almost always placed facing upward, directly against the skin. This allowed the person's own body heat to become trapped within the dense hair of the pelt, creating a warm, private microclimate for each individual. The geometry of the room was also set up to take advantage of the hearth. Because heat rises, the sleeping platforms were placed at just the right height to capture the warmth as it circulated toward the smoke hole. It was a perfect balance, low enough to be out of the coldest air, but high enough to be bathed in the gentle, radiant warmth of the fire. They often oriented their sleeping positions so their heads were toward the outer wool, and their feet pointed toward the center of the room. This ensured that if there were any minor drafts creeping in from the edges of the walls, they would hit the feet, which were the extremities most resilient to cold, rather than the face or chest. It was an orderly, quiet way of living. At night the fire would be dimmed to a steady glow, and the family would settle in this layered, insulated nest. This arrangement wasn't just about sleep. It was about the efficient use of the building's internal volume. By utilizing vertical space and layering materials, they turned a simple shelter into a highly effective thermal envelope. It's a design principle that holds true today. Insulation is not just about what you wear, but about how you separate yours from the surfaces that steal your heat. If you're enjoying this deep dive in the practical architecture of survival, please make sure to hit that like button. It tells us that these historical explorations are what you want to see more of. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit the button and join us. We have many more stories to uncover about the resilience of humanity. Did you know that these simple ancient techniques of layering are still the basis for how modern explorers survive in the polar regions? Let us know in the comments if you've ever tried to build a natural shelter. We'd love to hear your experiences. When the deep snows arrived, the challenge of finding food became a daily high, stakes game of observation and patience. In the warmer months, hunting often involved group efforts and expansive travel, but in the winter, energy conservation was the primary rule. The communities had to be smarter, not just faster. They focused their efforts on areas where they knew game would be seeking refuge, just as they thems were, in the sheltered thickets and the edges of the frozen wetlands. Tracking in the winter, however, was a different discipline. It wasn't about running down prey, it was about reading the story left on the surface of the snow. A fresh track could tell an experienced hunter everything they needed to know: the animal's size, its state of health, and exactly how long ago it had passed by. If the track was sharp and defined, the animal was nearby. If the edges had begun to soften or fill with wind-blown powder, the hunter knew it was a waste of precious calories to pursue. This ability to judge the age of a track was a vital skill that prevented unnecessary physical exertion. They relied heavily on traps and snares, which were much more energy-efficient than active hunting. By setting these along established game trails, narrow paths that animals used to move between food sources, they could let the forest do the work for them. These snares were simple, crafted from bent saplings and tough cordage made from sinew or inner bark. When an animal walked through the snare, the tension of the sapling would secure it. It was a silent, reliable way to provide a steady supply of protein without the need to track for hours on end, keeping the hunters safe and relatively warm near their base camps. The success of the winter hunt was never about taking more than was needed. It was about sustaining the group through the long stretch of February and March, often the hardest months when the initial winter stores began to dwindle. They treat the animals they harvest with immense respect, utilizing every part, not just for meat, but for the hides, bones, and sinew that would be used for clothing, tools, and repair. It was a closed-loop system where nothing was discarded and every resource was honoured. This period of the year taught them the value of rhythm. There were days when the weather was too severe to leave the shelter, and they remained indoors, focusing on mending gear or sharing stories. On the clear, cold days, they ventured out with purpose, reading the frozen landscape with the precision of a map. It was a life of careful balance, where the hunter was also the steward, ensuring that the community remained fed without depleting the very source of their survival. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. When the world around you is locked in ice, water becomes a paradoxical challenge. It is everywhere, yet it is entirely inaccessible to the human body in its frozen form. You cannot simply eat snow to quench your thirst. Doing so is actually counterproductive. The amount of body heat required to melt the snow within your stomach, temporarily, increasing the risk of hypothermia, impede rather than prevent it. The indigenous people understood this fundamental rule of biology, and they developed a careful, systematic approach to securing liquid water. The most reliable source was always a running stream or a spring that remained unfrozen. Even in the deepest cold, water moving over rocks or bubbling up from the earth often stays liquid. Finding these spots was a part of their daily routine. When such a source was nearby, they would mark it, often clearing away brush or snow to keep the access point open. Carrying water back to the camp containers made of birch bark or hollowed wood was a task done with precision, as spilling water in the freezy air meant creating a patch of ice that could be dangerous to walk on. When a running source wasn't available, they had to melt ice or snow. The key here was efficiency, using the smallest amount of fuel possible to turn solid ice into drinkable water. They never threw snow directly onto raging fire, which would only kill the flames and create a mess of steam. Instead, they used heated stones. By placing large, clean stones directly in the fire until they were glowing hot, they could then move them into a wooden bowl or a skin bag filled with chunks of ice. The hot stone would melt the ice from the inside out, creating a pool of water without ever needing to expose the container itself to the open flame. Storing this water inside the dwelling required another layer of care. If left in a container, it would freeze again overnight. To prevent this, they kept their water containers close to the hearth, the warm zone, but never directly in the way of the foot traffic. In some cases, they would wrap the containers in furs or place them in a sheltered alcove within the sleeping platform. using the ambient heat of the living space to keep the liquid just above the freezing point. Managing this resource was a test of patience. It meant the day always began and ended with the work of melting and gathering. It was a constant reminder that in the winter, resources were not simply there to be taken. They were to be managed, gathered, and maintained. This disciplined approach to water ensured that everyone remained hydrated, which is vital for the body to maintain its internal thermostat. A dehydrated body is far more susceptible to the cold, and by keeping a steady, reliable supply of water, they were effectively keeping them warmer and more capable of surviving the season. It was one of the many silent, invisible tasks that defined the difference between thriving and merely enduring. In the harsh winter, your clothing was your skin. If your shell, your outer layer of hide, was compromised, the cold would find you instantly. This meant that the maintenance of clothing was not just a chore, it was a non-negotiable part of daily life. The indigenous people were expert at keeping their gear in top condition, understanding that a small tear or a patch of dampness could quickly escalate into a serious survival risk. The primary enemy of winter clothing was moisture, whether from the outside in the form of snow or from the inside in the form of perspiration. When you were active, your body produced heat and moisture. If that moisture was trapped against your skin, it would freeze as soon as you stopped moving, creating a layer of ice that would conduct heat away from your body at an alarming rate. To prevent this, they practiced a system of constant drying. Every evening before settling down, they would inspect their garments. If a layer was damp, it was hung near the warmth of the fire, not close enough to scorch the leather, but near enough for the ambient heat to drive the moisture out. Leather, while incredibly durable, also needed regular tension. Without the natural oils found in the living animal, the hide would eventually become stiff and brittle in the dry, freezing air. To keep it soft and pliable, they would rub it with animal fats, tallow or bear grease. This served two purposes. It maintained the flexibility of the material, allowing for a full range of motion, and it provided a secondary water repellent barrier. A well-oiled hide would shed snow much better than a dry one, keeping the wearer drier for longer periods. Small repairs were done immediately. They kept repair kits, bundles of prepared sinew and bone needles, always at hand. Sinew is an extraordinary material. It is essentially a natural tendon that, when split into thin fibers, becomes as strong as modern nylon thread. It is also naturally resistant to water and does not stretch when wet, making it the perfect material for stitching leather and fur. A quick, running stitch to patch a seam or fix a tear in a moccasin was a standard part of their evening routine, done by the light of the hearth while sharing the events of the day. This culture of maintenance created a deep sense of attachment to one's belongings. Nothing was mass-produced, and nothing was disposable. Every garment was a piece of craftsmanship that represented hours of labour. By taking care of these items, they weren't just saving time. They were honouring the animal that provided the hide and the energy that went into processing it. It was a philosophy of stewardship that ensured they were always prepared for the next day, regardless of what the weather might bring. By the time the morning light hit the snow, their gear was dry, supple, and ready to protect them for another day in the wild. When the wind howls and the world turns white with a blinding blizzard, the forest can quickly become a disorienting, dangerous place. For the indigenous communities, safety wasn't just about individual strength. It was about the group's ability to stay connected and aware of each other's movements. Even in the most familiar territory, they never left anything to chance. They used a sophisticated silent language of signs and signals that allowed them to communicate across the snow-covered landscape, without the need for shouting, which would have been both ineffective in the wind and counterproductive to their need for stealth. The Mosaic system involved simple physical markers. When a hunter went out to check traps or scout for game, they didn't just walk blindly into the woods. They would leave a trail, a series of small intentional marks on the snow or strategically placed branches. These weren't just breadcrumbs. They were a clear communication system that told those back at the camp exactly where the person was heading, and more importantly, how to follow if there was an emergency. A broken twig pointed in a certain direction could indicate that the hunter had spotted game, or that a particular route had become blocked by deep drifts. They also used sound in a very controlled way. A high, pitched, piercing whistle, mimicked from the natural calls of local birds, could carry over long distance without sounding human or alarming the wildlife they were hunting. Each community had its own unique set of these signals, which served as a way to identify one another in the woods. If a hunter was out longer than expected, the people back at camp could use these calls to guide them home, through the dark or the snow, turning the forest into connected space rather than a place of isolation. The safety rule was simple: never be the only one to know where you were. Before anyone left the shelter, they informed the group of their intentions, their route, and their expected return time. If they didn't return by that time, the group had a pre-agreed plan on how to proceed. This was not a bureaucrat process, it was a survival necessity. By maintaining this constant awareness, they ensured that no one was left alone in a situation they couldn't handle. The social bond was the greatest safety net they had. This system of signalling was a reflection of their deep respect for the power of the wilderness. They knew that human beings are not built to survive alone in the Arctic cold. By using these signs and maintaining this constant communication, they minimized the risks of the environment. It turned the act of hunting or gathering from an individual risk into a calculated, group-supported activity. Even when some was physically alone in the woods, they were never truly disconnected from the community, and that sense of shared awareness provided a level of psychological security that was just as important as the warmth of their furs or the heat of their hearth. The transition from winter to spring was not an abrupt event marked by a calendar, but a slow, rhythmic unfolding that the community sensed long before it was visible to the eye. It began with the quality of the light. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its angle changed, bringing a subtle newfound warmth that felt like a whisper of promise against the skin. For those who had spent months living in the quiet, dim interior of the long house, this shift in light was the most profound signal of all. The forest began to communicate in its own way. The crust of the snow would soften during the day, becoming corn snow, which made a distinct crunching sound underfoot. The air, previously brittle and dry, took on a dampness, a sign that the frozen world was beginning to breathe. They watched the animals, the turning migratory birds, the stirring of hibernating creatures, and the way the deer began to move toward the early, budding shoots in the sun, drenched clearings. Each of these small signs was a piece of information, a clear message that the time for conservation was ending, and the time for renewal was near. This was the period where the management of their resource became a balance of careful planning and cautious optimism. They didn't abandon their winter protocols immediately. They knew that the false spring sudden bites in storms that were just as lethal as those in mid-January. They kept their hearths burning and their shelters tight, but they also began to prepare for the change. It was a time of cleaning and repair. The tools that had been used for ice work were set aside, and the gear for the spring fishing and planting was inspected and sharpened. There was a palpable sense of relief as the heavy protective layers of winter began to peel away. The social life of the community expanded as the barriers of the deep snow receded. People could travel more easily to visit neighbouring camps, trading stories and news of the season. It was the closing of a long, difficult chapter, but it was also a time of pride. They had endured. They had looked at the coldest, harshest months of the year and had come out the other side with their families intact and their community strong for the experience. The endurance of the winter was a shared victory. They hadn't just survived, they had learned, adapted, and maintained their way of life in the face of forces far greater than themselves. As they looked toward the coming spring, they carried with them the lessons of the cold, the value of preparation, the importance of the group, and the deep, abiding respect for the natural world that had provided everything they needed to survive. If you have enjoyed this documentary-style journey through the history of survival, we would love to hear from you. Hit the like button if this video brought you a moment of peace or new historical insight, and be sure to subscribe to join our future explorations. We want to know, what historic survival skill do you think is the most impressive, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments. Every reply helps us understand which stories resonate most with you. Thank you for walking through this long, cold season with us. When the fire was banked low at night, the only thing standing between the human body and the biting chill of the dark was the fur blanket. To the untrained eye, it might just look like a pile of animal skins, but to those who lived through the long freezing months, it was a marvel of biological engineering. A fur blanket was never just one hide thrown over a frame. It was a carefully constructed thermal system, designed to trap heat and block cold with a precision that modern synthetic fabrics still struggle to replicate. The foundation of a high-quality blanket began with the selection of the hides. They knew that different animals provided different types of insulation. For the layer closest to the body, they preferred softer, denser furs like beaver or muskrat. These pelts had incredibly high hair density, thousands of individual hairs per square inch, which created a thick, insulating, dead air space. This air, once warmed by the body, stayed trapped within the fur, acting as an invisible blanket of heat. The outer layers were often made from tougher, thicker hides like bear or moose, which acted as a windbreak. These were less about softness and more about durability and moisture resistance. The fur on these hides was long and coarse, designed by nature to shed water and deflect the biting wind. By layering a soft, dense inner hide with a rough, weather-resistant outer hide, they were essentially creating a multi-clad garment system that worked the same way as a modern cold-weather parka, but with entirely natural materials. Sewing these pelts together was a lesson in patience. They used the same prepared sinew we mentioned earlier, but the technique was specific. They used a butt stitch, where the edges of the hides were joined side by side rather than overlapping. This prevented the blanket from becoming bulky or creating lumps that would be uncomfortable to sleep on. The stitching had to be tight enough to ensure there were no gaps where the cold air could leak through, but flexible enough that the blanket could wrap snugly around the contours of the body. The most important part of the anatomy, however, was the care of the grain, the direction of the hair. They always oriented the pelts so that the fur lay in the same direction, which helped it shed moisture and maintain its loft. If the fur became matted or crushed, It lost its ability to hold air, and there lost its heat. Daily, they would shake out the blankets and brush the fur to ensure it stayed fluffy. It was a constant small effort, but it ensured that when the sun set and the temperature plummeted, the blanket would be waiting, ready to transform the freezing air into a pocket of profound, restorative warmth. It wasn't just a covering, it was a safe haven, crafted from the forest for the forest. In a setting where a broken tool could mean the difference between a warm meal and a hungry night, the maintenance of equipment was a ritual of survival. The materials they used, wood, bone, antler, and stone, were highly reactive to the extreme fluctuations of the season. The dry air inside a heated lodge could cause wood to shrink and crack, while repeated exposure to the freeze temperatures outside could make bone and antler brittle and prone to snapping. To keep their tools functional through the winter, they employed a strict cycle of inspection and care. Wooden tools such as bows, spear shafts, and tool handles were the most vulnerable. They were crafted from seasoned timber, but even then the constant transition between the humid warmth of the fire and the parched, frozen air of the outdoors put them under immense stress. To prevent warping or splitting, they were never stored leaning against a wall or lying on the ground. Instead, they were often kept in specific stable zones within the lodge, away from direct heat, but safe from the damp edges of the floor. When not in use, these items were frequently rubbed with animal fats, which served to seal the wood fibers and keep them flexible, preventing the grain from becoming too dry and brittle. Tools made of bone and antler required a different strategy. While these materials were incredibly tough, they were not immune to the cold. At sub-zero temperatures, even a thick antler awl could shatter like glass under the wrong amount of pressure. Before beginning any task, like drilling into frozen wood or scraping a stiff hide, they would gently warm the tool by the hearth. This wasn't to change its shape, but to bring its internal temperature up to a point where the material regained its natural resilience. It was a subtle, almost intuitive step, but it extended the life of their tools by years. Stonework, particularly blades made of flint or chert, was generally more stable, but they still required careful handling. The primary risk was impact damage. A blade dropped on a frozen rock-hard ground would chip far more easily than one dropped on a soft, mossy forest floor in the summer. They kept their cutting tools wrapped in protective leather pouches when they weren't in use, which cushioned them against accident drops and kept them clean of snow and grit. A clean, sharp edge was not just convenience. It was a matter of safety, as it meant less force was required to perform a task, reducing the risk of a slip that could cause injury. This constant vigilance over their gear was another form of conservation. They didn't have the luxury of replacements, and they didn't have a surplus of raw materials during the winter months. Repairing a tool, rebinding a head to a shaft with fresh sinew, or re-sharpening a dull edge was a task often performed in the evening. As they sat around the fire, they would examine their implements with the same focus they applied to their own well-being. It was a testament to their practicality. They understood that their tools were essentially an extension of their own hands, and that by taking care of the implement, they were ultimately ensuring the longevity and health of the group. As the season began to shift, the landscape changed from a static, frozen world into one that was once again in motion. For the hunter, this was a critical time of observation. Tracking in the depth of winter was about identifying the patterns of Anabaim's shelter. Tracking as the thaw approached was about identifying the patterns of animals beginning to forage. The environment was opening up, and the ability to read the subtle shifts in the landscape became the primary source of the community's seasonal replenishment. They looked for sign that went beyond simple footprints. They examined the vegetation for signs of browsing, the way branches were bitten or snapped, which told them which species were active and what they were assuming. They looked for disturbed patches of moss where an animal might have been digging for roots, or scuffed areas in the snow that indicated a bedding spot. In the early spring, when the snow was thin or patchy, these signs were the only way to track an animal. The hunter had to learn to see not just the obvious tracks, but the invisible disruptions in the natural order of the forest floor. The behavior of the animals then was a map. Birds began to return, their calls indicating the presence of open water or budding trees. Small mammals, emboldened by the changing light, became more active, moving farther from their burrows to find early growth. The hunters learned to time their movements with these animals. They weren't just pursuing prey, they were waiting for the right moment when the animal would be distracted by the urgency of feeding. It was a patient, calculated game of timing that conserved the hunter's energy while maximizing the chances of a successful harvest. This tracking was also a way of understanding the health of the ecosystem. By observing which areas were seeing the most activity, they could determine where to set their focus for the coming months. They would mark these hotspots, the edges of streams, the sun, drenched southern slopes, and the thickets where early shoots were sprouting, and prioritize them for their return trips. They were essentially reading the forest's recovery, identify the places where life was returning first, and aligning their own survival strategy with the pulse of the warming earth. It was a transition from the defensive hunting of the winter, where they relied on traps and stationary caches, to the active hunting of the spring. The mindset shifted from conserving to gathering, but the core principle remained the same: respect for the animal and extreme efficiency in every movement. They knew that the early spring could still be unforgiving, and the animals they sought were just as vulnerable as they were. This period required a heightened sense of connection to the woods, a realization that they were a part of the forest's cycle, and that by reading the tracks correctly, they were ensuring not just their own survival, but the continued balance of the landscape they called home. As the days began to stretch and the grip of the deepest cold softened, the character of the evening hours inside the lodge underwent a subtle transformation. Throughout the peak of winter, the evenings were defined by intense, focused quiet, a time for mending, for sharpening, and for conserving every scrap of warmth. But as the prospect of spring grew more tangible, the atmosphere within the walls became more reflective, a bridge between the survival of the past months and the hope of the coming season. The hearth remained the anchor of these evenings, but the way the family gathered around it shifted. They were no longer simply huddling for warmth. They were sitting in a circle of shared memory. This was the time for the oral traditions, the storytelling that held the history of their people. Elders would recount tales of previous winters, of successes and trials, weaving in the lessons of the land. These stories were not just entertainment. They were a living library, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of survival was passed down perfectly to the younger generation. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic process. The low crackle of the fire, the steady movement of hands repairing tools, and the cadence of a voice carrying history through the dark. This was also a period of cyclical consolidation. They had spent months in close proximity, and the social harmony of the lodge was a fragile, essential asset. The evening rhythm was designed to foster this. by engaging in shared task, preparing dried meat for the next day, stitching a new piece of gear, or simply grooming the furs. They reinforced their reliance on one another. The tasks were repetitive and steady, creating a calm, meditative space where frustrations could dissolve and communal bonds were tightened. It was a deliberate, collective effort to maintain the internal climate of the lodge as stable and supportive as the physical one. The transition towards spring also at a change in the closing rituals of the night, where mid-winter nights required absolute, rigid adherence to the conservation of heat, sealing every vent, banking the fire to the last ember. The late-season evenings allowed for a slightly more relaxed approach. They could afford to keep the fire a little brighter, a little longer. This subtle shift was felt by everyone. It was a psychological exhale. The anxiety that had been present in the darkest weeks was replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. As they finally prepared to settle in their sleeping platforms, the lodge felt different. It was no longer just a bunker against the storm. It had become a sanctuary of resilience. The evening rhythm was the height of the community, a pulse that ensured that even when the outside world was frozen and silent, the human connection remained vibrant and warm. They would fall asleep to the fading glow of the hearth, their minds comforted by the knowledge that they had navigated the long cold together, and that tomorrow the world would be just a little bit brighter. The impending thaw was not a moment for sudden action, but for methodical preparation. Those who lived by the rhythms of the land understood that the change from winter to spring was arguably the most dangerous time of the year. When the snow began to melt, the ground would turn into mire of mud, and the frozen streams would swell into unpredictable torrents. To be caught unprepared for this breakup was to risk losing everything they had worked so hard to store. Preparation, therefore, became a process of structural and logistical reorganization. The first step was reinforcing the integrity of their shelter against the coming moisture. Throughout the winter, the snow had acted as an additional layer of insulation, packing against the walls and roof, keeping the internal heat trapped. As this snow turned to slush, it threatened to seep through the bark or hide coverings, bring dampness where they had worked so hard to keep things dry. They spent these days clearing the base of the shelter, digging small drainage channels in the mud to divert the melting water away from the living area. They also checked the structural lashing of the roof, tightening the cords that held the bark sheets in place, to ensure that the inevitable spring rains would shed off the exterior rather than dripping onto their gear. Inside the lodge, they began the process of unlayering. The heavy furs and extra mats that were essential for the sub-zero nights were systematically sorted, cleaned and packed away in elevated, dry storage. By reducing the clutter inside the structure, they allowed for better airflow, which was crucial for drying out the lodge after months of trapped humidity. They also began to move their stockpiles, the remaining food caches and the heavy winter gear, from the ground-level storage to higher, drier platforms. They knew that when the thaw hit, the low-lying areas of the camp might temporarily become saturated, and nothing was to be left to chance. This was also the time to finalize the repair of their warm weather equipment. Canoes, which had been stored and covered during the winter, were inspected for cracks or leaks in their birch bark hulls. The pitch, a mixture of resin and animal fat used to seal the seams, was prepared and applied, making the vessels ready for the first open water. The nets and lines for spring fishing were unspooled, checked for rot or damage, and re-strung. Every tool was checked against the upcoming change in the environment, ensuring that when the ice finally cleared, they would be ready to transition from a mode of endurance to a mode of activity. It was a period of calculated, steady labour. There was a sense of urgency, but it was a controlled, professional urgency. They treated the thaw with the same respect they had shown the deep freeze. It was not a time to rush into the open, but a time to ensure that when they did, they were equipped, organised, and structurally prepared to handle the challenges of a landscape in flux. By the time the first real trickles of meltwater began to cascade down the hillsides, their base of operations was secure. Their gear was ready, and they were in a position of strength, prepared to meet the spring on their own terms. In the late winter, the landscape is a monochromatic study in white, grey, and brown. The return of colour is not a subtle shift, it is a profound event that marks the breaking of the long cold. The appearance of the first green, those resilient, early emerging plants, was not merely a beaut of sight, it was the most important dietary signal of the entire year. After months of relying on dried meats, preserved berries, and stored roots, the body craved the vibrant living nutrients found only in fresh vegetation. Finding these early greens required an intimate, almost micropeck knowledge of the local geography. Knew exactly which southern-facing slopes would shed their snow cover first. These small, sun-drenched patches were the first to wake up. They looked for specific indicators, the swelling of buds on willow and poplar trees, or the very first appearance of ramp leaves or fiddlehead, ferns pushing their way through the thawing, damp soil. These plants were the harbingers of the season, and their arrival triggered a distinct shift in the camp's routine. This was not a time for mass collection, but for cautious, targeted gathering. The community understood the fragility of this early growth. They took only what was needed, ensuring that the roots remained undisturbed so the plants could continue to propagate. This was a form of stewardship, a recognition that if they harvested with greed, they would lose the resource for the following year. They consumed these first greens quickly, often raw or lightly wilted by the hearth, to maximize their nutritional benefit. For a body that had been operating on a high-protein, high-fat winter diet, the introduction of fresh, mineral-rich greens acted as a powerful metabolic reset. Beyond the immediate dietary necessity, there was a deep psychological significance to this search. Being the first to spot the green was a badge of honour for the younger members of the community, a way to test their observational skills and their connection to the land. It became a communal game of discovery. Bringing the first bundle of fresh greens back to lodge was a moment of celebration. It proved that the earth was healthy. The cycle was continuing, and that the long dark season of confinement had finally definitively ended. This foraging for the first green was the true beginning of the transition into the season of abundance. It marked the moment when they stopped looking at the ground as a source of cold and began to see it as a source of life. By integrating these small, vital nutrients in their diet, they effectively boosted their energy levels, sharpening their senses for the active months of fishing, gathering, and moving that lay ahead. It was a reminder that in the natural world, nothing is truly lost. It is only waiting for the right moment to return. As the temperatures climbed above the freezing mark, the silent glass-like surface of the frozen rivers began to change. The sound of spring was not the chirping of birds, but the deep, ominous groaning of ice breaking apart. This breakup was a powerful, transformative force. Large sheets of ice would crack and grind against each other, carried by the rising volume of meltwater, clearing the paths for the fish that were beginning their seasonal migration. For the community, the river was no longer a frozen barrier. It had become the primary artery of their spring survival. Fishing during this transition was an exercise in extreme timing. They knew that as the water cleared and the current increased, the fish, particular species like trout, suckers, and whitefish, would be moving upstream to spawn. The hunters turned. Fishers set their stations at specific pinch points, narrow channels, shallow rapids, or below natural obstructions like log jams, where the fish would naturally congregate. They used a variety of tools, most notably the weir, a semi-permanent structure built from driven stakes and woven branches. This allowed them to funnel the fish into a manageable area, creating a highly efficient method of harvesting that required minimal energy expenditure. The atmosphere on the riverbank was drastically different from the quiet tension of the winter hunt. There was a sense of collective purpose and shared labour. Men, women and children worked in concert to clear the banks, tend the weirs and process the catch. The air was filled with the sound of rushing water and the calls of those monitoring the river's movement. It was a period of intense, concentrated effort because the window for this migration was short. They had to maximize this bounty to replenish their depleted stores and provide the fresh, vital protein needed for the busy months of building and gathering that lay ahead. Preservation was immediate. The catch was cleaned on the spot, and a large portion was set aside for smoking. They constructed temporary racks over their hearths, or built external drying structures if the weather allowed, to cure the fish. The wood used for the fire was selected specifically for its smoke profile, adding flavour and acting as a preservative agent. This was the second fill of the year, a cache of smoked fish that would serve as a hedge against the unpredictability of the early spring months. Watching the river flow again was a profound psychological release. After months of relying on what they had hoarded, the sight of the water moving, and with it, the return of a reliable, abundant food source, was a massive relief for the community. The river was a reminder that the environment was once again providing, by aligning their techniques with the seasonal rhythm of the waters, they were doing more than just feeding them. They were validating their place within the cycle of the land, proving that they could adapt to the river's thaw as surely as they had endured its freeze. The isolation of the winter months, while necessary for survival, created a distinct psychological boundary. Each family unit or small group had functioned as a self-contained entity, their entire world defined by the walls of their long house and the immediate perimeter of their camp. But as the snow melted and the trails became passable, the forest ceased to be a place of confinement and became a bridge. The season of social renewal had begun, a time for the separate threads of the community to weave them back together. This reconnection was deliberate and formal. Scouts were sent out, not just to look for game, but to locate neighbouring camps. When two groups encountered one another after long separation, it was a moment of profound significance. They would share news of the winter, who had thrived, who had suffered, and what the landscape had revealed to them. These meetings were the primary method of information exchange in the ancient world. They traded not just physical goods like obsidian, specific types of wood, or rare medicinal roots, but also the intellectual currency of survival. Knowledge of where the deer were migrating, which valleys had been flooded, or which berry patches were showing early life. The social renewal served a vital purpose beyond logistics. It was a way to reinforce the collective identity of the tribe. In the winter, the focus had been narrowed down to the survival of the immediate family. In the spring, the focus expanded back to the health of the entire culture. Rituals, feasts, and shared labour projects during these first spring gatherings helped to dissolve the accumulated tensions of the long, cramped winter. It was a time to realign their shared values and prepare for the large-scale communal activities such as building new structures or organising long-distance trade expeditions that required more manpower than any single family could provide. For the younger members of the community, these gatherings were essential. They met peers from other camps, heard different stories, and saw new ways of doing things. It prevented the stagnation of knowledge and ensured that the cultural map of their people remained dynamic. They were no longer just children of a specific lodge, they were part of a larger, resilient whole. The sense of belonging to a wider network provided a different kind of security, the knowledge that they were part of a support system that stretched far beyond their own line of sight. As the groups parted ways to return to their seasonal work, they did so with a renewed sense of purpose. The loneliness of the winter had been replaced by the confidence of the collective. They were now connected by the common threads of their experiences, and they carried with them the plans for the coming summer. The forest, once a place that demanded absolute individual focus, was now a vibrant, interconnected community space. By weaving them back together, they ensured that their culture would not just survive the season, but would thrive in the cycles to come. As the community settled in the rhythms of spring, the lessons of the winter were still fresh in everyone's minds. This transient period was most critical window for education. While the physical survival during the cold was a success, the memory of that survival had to be distilled into knowledge for the next generation. The elders understood that the most dangerous thing a community could do was to forget how it had survived the winter. Therefore, the spring not just a time for gathering food, but a time for deep, intentional instruction. Education did not happen in a classroom, it happened in the practice of daily work. If a young person had struggled with a particular type of knot during the winter, the spring was time to have them learn it under the calm guidance of an elder, away from the pressure of a blizzard. They reviewed the why behind every survival decision. Why was the firewood cached in that specific spot? Why was the water source managed in that particular way? These were not just practical tips. They were the fundamental philosophies of the tribe, taught through the lens of lived experience. Storytelling played a central role in this process. By recounting the events of the winter through narratives, the elders encoded complex survival data into form that was easy to remember and emotionally resonant. They didn't just teach facts, they taught the spirit of the work. They told stories of the mistakes made, a trap poorly set, a fire allowed to burn too low, so that the younger generation could learn from those errors without having to endure the same dangers themselves. It was an apprenticeship of the mind and the hands, ensuring that the collective wisdom of the tribe was updated and refined with every passing cycle. These lessons all included a deep moral component. They taught that the land was not a commodity to be exploited, but a partner to be respected. The young were taught the ethics of the harvest, how to thank the animal that provided its life, how to use every part of a resource, and why it was wrong to take more than was needed for the group's health. This sense of stewardship was as vital to their long-term survival as the ability to hunt or build. By instilling these values in the spring, the elders ensured that when the next winter came, the community would not only be skilled, but also morally grounded and unified in their approach to the natural world. For the younger members, this period of instruction was empowering. They saw their role not as passive observers, but as the future stewards of the tribe's survival. Their newfound skills gave them a sense of autonomy and pride, and their understanding of the why behind their actions created a deeper connection to their history. When the elders shared their knowledge, they were not just transferring information, they were passing on the identity of the people. By the time the spring reached its peak, the community was not only replenished in body, but significantly strengthened in its collective memory and its dedication to the wisdom that had allowed them to endure for generations. When the final remnants of the winter snow had vanished and the earth began to bake under the long, golden days of early summer, the permanent, heavy, timbered long houses that had protected the community through the deep freeze were left behind. These structures were designed for endurance, for heat retention, and for stability against heavy snow loads. They were entirely unsuited for the sweltering, humid heat of the coming months. The architectural philosophy shifted from fortress to flow. The community transitioned to summer camps, characterized by light, portable, and highly breathable structures. The summer lodge was a masterpiece of simplicity. It was often a domed or conical frame made from supple, flexible saplings, willow or dogwood, that could be easily sourced and erected in a single afternoon. Instead of thick, heavy skins or bark, the walls were covered with woven mats made from reeds, cattails, or large leafy boughs. These materials provided shade from the direct intensity of the sun, while allowing the smallest breeze to pass through, effectively keeping the interior of the lodge at ambient temperatures. It was a living structure, one that responded to the movement of the air rather than resisting it. This shift in architecture was a vital part of their environmental intelligence. By moving out of the permanent winter structures and into these airy, temporary lodges, they prevented the build-up of dampness and the infestation of insects, which were the hidden enemies of the warm season. If a location became too buggy, or if the nearby resource were temporarily exhausted, they could simply dismantle their summer homes, roll up their mats, and move to a fresh clearing within hours. This modularity gave them a degree of mobility that was essential for following the migratory patterns of game and the seasonal blooming of plant life. The organization of the summer camp also changed to mirror the open landscape. Whereas the winter camp was a tight circle focused inward toward the hearth, the summer camp was often more dispersed. Living areas were spread out with dedicated zones for different activities: a sun-drenched space for drying berries, a shaded area by the water for processing fish, and a communal fire ring that served as the social hub during the mild evenings. Everything was geared toward maximizing the use of natural light and ventilation. This transition was a profound ecological shift. The tight, claustrophobic necessity of winter living gave way to the expansive freedom of the summer. They were no longer guarding their lives, they were exploring them. The summer architecture was an invitation to be part of the world outside, rather than a barrier against it. By designing their homes to be as fleeting and adaptive as the seasons themselves, they maintained a delicate, sustainable balance with the forest, ensuring that their presence left as little impact as possible on the land that sustained them. With the arrival of the full summer heat, the forest transformed into a vast living apothecary. While winter survival was defined by the caloric intake of fats and proteins, summer survival was defined by the management of health and the prevention of ailment. The community recognized that the humid, warm months brought their own unique set of challenges: localized infections from minor wounds, digestive disruptions from changing diets, and the persistent annoyance of insect-borne irritation. Consequently, the foragers shifted their focus from food to the sophisticated identification and processing of medicinal plants. Their botanical knowledge was not a collection of superstitions, but a body of empirical data passed down through centuries of observation. They knew, for instance, exact which bark contained high concentrations of salicylic acid, like compounds to reduce inflammation and fever. They understood which mosses possessed natural antiseptic properties to be used as bandages for cuts sustained during active summer work. This was not a passive collection, it was a targeted seasonal harvest. They had to gather these plants at the precise stage of their growth, some at the moment of budding, others only after they had flowered, to ensure the potency of their chemical compounds. The process of preservation was equally technical. Unlike food, which was often dried or smoked for bulk energy, medicinal plants were treated with delicate care. Leaves were hung in shaded, airy areas to prevent them from losing their volatile oils to the sun's UV rays. Roots were carefully cleaned, sliced, and dried to prevent mold from settling into the fibrous material. They were stored in specialized, moisture-proof containers, often made from hollowed out gourds or tight-stitched skins, to maintain their efficacy. This storage was a critical insurance policy. They knew that once the frost returned, these dried tinctures and salves would be the primary defense against the inevitable ailments of the next winter. Furthermore, this foraging practice reinforced the community's role as landscape managers. By intentionally harvesting certain plants, they managed the population dynamics of the forest floor, ensuring that medicinal species were not outcompeted by more aggressive vegetation. It was a practice of gardening in the wild, where they nurtured the growth of their essential medicine while respecting the balance of the ecosystem. Every elder had their own specialized recipe for treating common ailments, and these were shared during the summer gatherings, creating a collective health knowledge database that significantly increased the community's overall resilience. This botanical focus required a heightened state of observation. The foragers had to learn to distinguish between species that looked nearly identical but possessed vastly different properties, sometimes based on subtle difference in leaf shape or the scent of the crushed stem. This deep sensory connection to the plant life was a form of intelligence that modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate. By mastering the forest medicine, they turned the summer from a time of simple survival into time of fortification, ensuring the community was healthy, robust, and prepared for the long-term demands of their environment. The Great Migration was not a haphazard wandering, but a highly synchronized movement governed by the pulse of the ecosystem. It was the seasonal relocation of the entire community from the lower river, valley wintering grounds to the diverse high-altitude territories that opened up once the snow line retreated. This migration was a logistical undertaking of immense proportions, requiring the coordination of multiple family units, the transport of accumulated supplies, and the navigation of treacherous, shifting terrain. It was the period when their dependency on the land was most visible, as they aligned their own survival cycles with the migratory patterns of large game and the ripening of high elevation flora. Preparation for this journey began weeks in advance. The heavy, non-essential equipment, stone mortars, excess pelts, and long-term storage caches were either carefully stowed in protected, elevated locations or consolidated for transport. Utilized a variety of load, bearing techniques back, frames constructed from light, sturdy wood, typically ash or hickory, lined with soft fur to prevent chafing. A simple, effective sled, like structure dragged behind the walkers to move heavier loads over the rough, rocky ground. These methods were engineered to distribute weight efficiently, allowing the group to traverse miles of uneven terrain without exhausting their vital energy reserves. Navigation was a feat of collective memory. There were no written maps, so the route was held in the stories and songs of the elders. They moved along ancestral paths that were most efficient routes through the mountains, avoiding the dangers of flooded ravines or unstable, shale-covered slopes. The pace was deliberate. They travelled during the cooler hours of the day to avoid the midday heat, and they scouted ahead to ensure that the water sources at their next campsite were not stagnant or contaminated by the spring runoff. This was not a race. It was a disciplined trek where the maintenance of the group's physical health was prioritized over raw speed. The psychological impact of this movement was profound. By abandoning the sites of their winter struggle, the community underwent a process of renewal. They were literally leaving behind the dead weight of the cold season, the dirt, the lingering sickness, and the anxieties of survival. As they ascended into the highlands, the air became cleaner, the landscapes opened up into panoramic vistas, and the sense of possibility replaced the singular focus on endurance. This transition was a crucial reset for their morale. It reaffirmed their status as masters of their landscape, proving they could adapt their living conditions as fluidly as the animals they followed. Arriving at the highland camp was a moment of technical success. They would establish a temporary base near reliable springs and high-altitude hunting grounds, where the game was now concentrated. The speed and efficiency with which they could reconstruct their living quarters, unrolling the mats and raising the sapling frames, was the ultimate test of their preparation. This great migration was the definitive proof of their expertise. It demonstrated that they were not merely victims of the seasons, but active participants in the environment, capable of orchestrating their lives to thrive in the most challenging and diverse conditions of the wilderness. The summer months, characterized by the relative stability of the weather and the increased accessibility of the high-altitude passes, transformed the landscape into an interconnected network of exchange. These trade routes were not merely paths for commerce, they were the essential information highways of the ancient world. The community viewed the summer not just as a time for gathering resources, but as a critical window to expand their inventory of specialized materials through long-distance trade. By connecting with distant groups, sometimes hundreds of miles away, they acquired the high-quality lithic materials, rare pigments and durable fibers that were unavailable in their home territory. Central to this trade was the concept of the value added material. They did not simply trade raw items, they traded finished goods that represent their specific environmental expertise. For example, a community in the dense coniferous forest might trade exquisitely crafted, resin-sealed birch bark containers, which were essential for water transport and long-term storage, to a group in the arid plains in exchange for high-grade obsidian or chert. This specialization allowed groups to focus on perfecting specific technologies, knowing they could bridge their resource gaps through reliable, seasonal trading partnerships. The logistics of these expeditions were demanding and required a high level of diplomatic skill. Trade parties were typically small, mobile, and highly disciplined, chosen for their speed and ability to navigate unfamiliar territories. They carried only the most compact high-value goods to maximize their carry capacity, often utilized standardized bundles that served as a form of currency in terms of weight and utility. Arrival at a designated trade ground, often a natural landmark like a significant river confluence or a mound pass, was governed by strict, long-standing protocols. These meetings were a fusion of ceremony and calculation, where stories were exchanged alongside goods, ensuring that the relationships remained stable and that news of distant hunting conditions or environmental changes flowed freely between disparate populations. Beyond the physical materials, the trade routes functioned as a robust system of cultural cross-pollination. When they encountered distant groups, they were also trading techniques, social practices, and innovations. A more efficient way to stitch a moccasin, a new method for treating a specific wood with fat, or even a novel strategy for trapping a particular species of bird. These were the invisible items that flowed across the routes. This exchange prevented technological stagnation and ensured that the community's toolset and survival strategies were constantly evolving. It created a collective intelligence that was significantly greater than the sum of its parts. Ultimately, these summer trade routes were the primary insurance against regional scarcity. If a particular winter had been devastating, or if a localized blight had hit their specific valley, the connections forged during the summer ensured that they were not isolated in their hardship. By maintaining these links, they ensured the long-term viability of their people. They knew that their survival was inextricably linked to the network of which they were a part, and that by investing in these relationships, they were building a safety net that spanned the entirety of their world. While summer was a season of abundance, the fundamental mindset of the community remained anchored in the reality of the coming winter. They understood that the peak of the season, the ripening of berries, the spawning of fish, and the maturation of edible tubers was a fleeting window that had to be captured. Preservation was not an afterthought. It was a comprehensive, labour-intensive process that transformed the perishable bounty of the forest into stable, shelf-ready assets. This was the most disciplined phase of the year, where every hour of daylight was leveraged to ensure the future security of the group. The techniques of preservation were tailored specifically to the chemical makeup of the item. For proteins like fish or game, they utilized a dual-stage process. First, the meat was thinly sliced to maximize surface area and then cured with a combination of smoke and heat over controlled hardwood-fueled fires. The hardwood, such as hickory or oak, was chosen not just for heat, but for the specific phenolic compounds in its smoke, which acted as a natural antimicrobial agent, penetrating the meat and sealing it against spoilage. The result was a shelf, stable protein that could withstand months of varying temperatures without losing its nutritional density. Fruits and vegetables required a different approach. Berries were mashed and spread in thin, uniform layers onto bark or flat stones to sun, dry, creating dense, nutrient-rich leathers that could be easily stored in compact rolls. Tubers and roots were often washed, sliced, and dehydrated near the gentle, consistent heat of the peripheral fire zone, where they would slowly lose their water content without being cooked or scorched. Once fully dried, these items were packed in tightly woven baskets or skin bags and treated with a final sealant of rendered animal fat, a technique known as pemmicanizing, when applied to meat and berries, which created an airtight barrier against moisture and pests. The logistical challenge was the storage of this immense volume of material. They employed a tiered system of caches, strategically placed to protect the food from both animals and the elements. Some caches were elevated on high platforms in trees to thwart scavenging mammals, while others were buried in deep, earth-lined pits that utilized the ground's natural, cool insulation to maintain a steady temperature. These caches were never located near the living quarters to avoid attracting predators. Instead, they were dispersed throughout their territory, acting as a decentralized insurance policy. If one cache was compromised by a bear or spoiled by an unexpected flood, the community would not face total starvation. This entire process was governed by a strict collective work ethic, the elder generation having the most experience with the specific variables of their climate, acted as supervisors, determining the precise timing for each harvest and the optimal method for each preservation run. The younger members were tasked with the strenuous work of transport and fire management, learned the importance of consistency in their labour. They understood that every pound of food properly processed was a day of security in the darkness of February. By the end of summer, the landscape was effectively transformed into a warehouse of their own making, a testament to their foresight and their technical mastery over the perishability of the natural world. For a people whose existence was dictated by the turning of the seasons, the sky was the most precise instrument they possessed. While the landscape provided the immediate resource for life, the heavens provided the framework for time. During the long, clear nights of summer, when the sky was free from the heavy cloud cover of winter, the community turned their gaze upward. Celestial navigation and timekeeping were not abstract sciences. They were the essential mechanisms that allowed the community to anticipate the arrival of the cold, the timing of migrations, and the scheduling of their communal gatherings. They observed the movement of the stars with an intensity that bordered on the scientific. By tracking the rising and setting points of specific constellations against fixed geological markers on the horizon, a jagged mountain peak or a prominent ridge, they established a reliable horizon calendar. They knew precisely when the long nights were approaching based on the position of the stars at twilight. This allowed them to initiate their major preparations, such as the final stockpiling of firewood and the reinforcing of dwellings, well before the first frost made such labour difficult or impossible. Navigation was equally rooted in this celestial expertise. When they travelled to distant trade grounds or moved between seasonal camps, they relied on star paths. They identified guide stars that remained stable throughout the night, using them to maintain a constant heading over miles of featureless forest or open plains. This was particularly critical during the transition periods, when the landscape might be obscured by fog, or when the visual landmarks of the forest were hidden by the shifting snow. By aligning their travel with the celestial cycles, they ensured they would never lose their way, regardless of how far they wandered from their base. The celestial cycle also played a vital role in the social and spiritual life of the community. Certain stellar alignment served as the alarm clock for major seasonal events. When a specific constellation reached the zenith of the sky at midnight, it signaled the time for a harvest festival or a major community council. These events were not just arbitrary celebrations, they were moments of synchronization where disparate groups could meet at pre-arranged locations, knowing that their celestial clocks would bring them together at the exact right moment. This shared timekeeping was a powerful tool for social cohesion, ensuring that despite the vastness of the wilderness, their culture moved as a unified body. The elders were the masters of this celestial knowledge, acting as the keepers of the rhythm. They spent hours training the younger generation, teaching them to map the movements of the night sky as easily as they mapped the trails of the forest. They understood that the stars were the only constant in an ever-changing world. While the game might migrate, the weather might turn, and the water might dry up, the movement of the heavens was predictable and unchanging. By mastering the art of the sky, the community gained a profound sense of psychological security. They were no longer subject to the chaotic whims of nature, but were instead partners in a vast, predictable and orderly cosmic cycle. As the summer sun began its slow, inevitable arc toward the shorter days of autumn, the community engaged in what could be described as the philosophy of equilibrium. This was not merely a state of being, but a sophisticated, active practice of balancing consumption with regeneration. Having spent the height of the summer gathering, trading and preparing, they reached a point of strategic reflection. They understood that the abundance of the current season was a credit provided by the land, and it was their duty to ensure that this credit did not lead to a deficit in the coming cycle. Their approach to equilibrium was rooted in the concept of measured impact. Every resource extraction was balanced by a calculated period of dormancy or rotation. If they had utilized a specific fishing weir extensively during the spring and early summer, they would dismantle or abandon that site for the remainder of the year, allowing the local fish populations to spawn and recover without further pressure. They viewed the forest not as a static pantry, but as a dynamic, regenerative system that required rest days just as much as human muscles did. This was the fundamental difference between survival and stewardship. One extracts until exhaustion, the other harvests until sustainability. This philosophy extended to their own social structure as well. The summer, with its high mobility and frequent interactions with other groups, had been a time of social expansion. As autumn approached, they prepared to pivot back toward the inward focus of the winter. They facilitated a social cooling, a gradual wind down of large-scale gatherings and trade expeditions. They helped the youth transition from the excitement of external exploration back to the discipline of internal learning. It was a rhythmic contraction, a voluntary pulling back of their influence to allow the surrounding environment and their own minds to prepare for the solitude of the cold months. There was also a profound psychological component to this equilibrium, the acceptance of transience. They understood that no season, no bounty, and no social state was permanent. They avoided the trap of summer greed, the impulse to hold on to the abundance of the season longer than the environment allowed. When the leaves began to turn and the air acquired its first sharp, titanic edge, they were the first to embrace the change. They didn't cling to the summer, they accepted the necessity of the shift. This adaptability prevented the crushing disappointment that often accompanies the end of a good season. Instead, it was met with a quiet, prepared resolve. In these final weeks of the cycle, they practiced gratitude not as a spiritual abstract, but as a survival mechanism. By acknowledging the sources of their resource, the river, the grove, the animal, and the star, they reinforced their commitment to their own role within the ecosystem. They understood that they were not separate from the natural order, but a component of it. When they looked at the landscape, they didn't just see a collection of objects to be consumed. They saw a life support system that they were responsible for maintaining. This philosophy of equilibrium was the anchor of their existence, the mental framework that allowed them to survive not just one winter, but hundreds, remaining consistent and resilient as the world turned around them. The smoke curing ritual was the definitive threshold between the harvest and the winter hold. As the annual migration reached its peak, the camp transformed into a massive, open-air processing plant. This was not merely the act of drying meat. It was a high-stakes preservation science where the quality of the product determined the survival margin for the coming 4 months. The air in the camp became heavy and fragrant with the sharp, acrid scent of curing fires. A smell that served as both a practical necessity and a symbolic marker that the tribe was prepared for the coming dark. The methodology was precise. Hunters brought back carcasses that were immediately processed to prevent the rapid onset of bacterial growth in the autumn warmth. The meat was sliced into long, uniform strips. This was essential for ensuring the smoke penetrated evenly and that the moisture content was removed at a consistent rate. They used specially stone scrapers maintained at a razor-sharp edge to remove every trace of fat from the surface of the strips, as residual fat would turn rancid and jeopardize the entire batch. This was grueling precision labor, often carried out by the entire community in a rhythmic assembly line fashion. The smoking chambers were structures designed for thermal efficiency. These were typically small, conical huts made of tightly woven poles and bark, allowing for controlled airflow. The fire was the heart of the operation. They used specific hardwoods, or maple, for its sweet, complex flavor, avoiding softwoods like pine, which produced resinous, soot-heavy smoke that would ruin the meat's taste and potentially introduce toxins. The fire was never allowed to flare. It was kept at a low smouldering burn that produced a cool, dense smoke. This cold smoking process was the key to preservation, as it dehydrated the meat without cooking it, retained the proteins and nutrients. Monitoring the smoke was a full-time, round-the-clock responsibility. The smoke tenders took shifts, constantly adjusting the wood supply and ensuring the ventilation at the top of the hut remained optimal. A single shift in wind direction or a lapse in fire management could lead to uneven curing. They tested the meat's readiness not by a timer, a properly cured strip, a specific leather, like resistance, a deep mahogany color, and a concentrated savory aroma. It was a sensory-based quality control system that had been perfected through centuries of trial and error. By the time a batch was completed, the yield was substantial, a dense, portable, and nearly indestructible food supply. Once removed from the smoke huts, the meat was cooled and stored in moisture-proof skin bags, often layered with dried herbs to repel insects. This was the gold standard of their winter rations. Observing the rows of finished product hanging in the storage caches provided the community with a profound sense of psychological stability. They had taken the raw, fleeting life of the hunt and converted it into stable, enduring form of energy. When the first true snowstorm hit, they would not be out hunting for their next meal. They would be eating the fruits of this intense, focused ritual, safe within the walls they had fortified. As the final amber leaves were stripped from the trees by the intensifying winds, the architectural focus shifted from breathability to thermal containment. The airy temporary summer lodges were dismantled, and the community turned its collective energy to the hardening of the primary winter structures. This was an exercise in structure engineering where the goal was to eliminate the thermal bridge, the gaps through which precious heat could escape and frozen air could infiltrate. They weren't just building walls, they were creating a microclimate designed to withstand the brutal temperature differential between the interior hearth and the sub-zero exterior. The first step was the reinforcement of the exterior envelope. They used a sophisticated mixture known as daub, a composite of clay, animal hair, and dried grasses. This was packed into every crack in the timber frames and smeared over the bark walls to create an airtight seal. The clay served as the primary thermal mass, absorbing the heat from the hearth throughout the day and slow radiating it back into space during the long freezing nights. It was a primitive yet highly effective form of insulation that transformed the longhouse from a wooden shell into heat-retaining fortress. The ground-level perimeter was treated with special attention, as this was the most common site for heat loss. They banked the exterior walls with earth, mounding a thick layer of packed soil, rocks, and pine needles piled high against the base of the longhouse. This acted as a buffer, shielding the floor from the biting wind and preventing the frost from penetrating through the foundation. Inside, they elevated their sleeping platforms by lifting their beds off the cold earth and covering them with layers of thick, fur-lined mats and dry bedding. They moved into the warmer air pocket that naturally accumulated near the ceiling, maximizing the comfort of their sleeping quarters. Efficiency was also applied to the entryways. They constructed baffle systems, a series of double, curtained skin flaps separated by a small enclosed porch area. This served as an airlock, ensuring that when someone entered or exited, the main living space was never directly exposed to the exterior gale. This simple engineering feat was critical. It prevented the sudden temperature drops that could shock the hearth's fire and waste the carefully gathered fuel. Every detail, from the angle of the roof to the density of the wall, packing were calculated to minimize energy expenditure. The hardening process was as much a psychological preparation as a physical one. As the community worked together to seal the walls, they were metaphorically closing them off from the harshness of the outside world. The process created a shared space that was uniquely theirs, a warm amber-lit sanctuary that felt increasingly detached from the darkening forest. By the time the first real blizzard howled against the reinforced walls, the interior remained a steady, protected environment. They had successfully created a thermal fission habitat, proof that their mastery of the landscape extended the very architects that sustained them through the winter. In the final weeks before the deep freeze, the nature of the hunt shifted dramatically. While summer hunting was often about opportunistic harvesting, the autumn hunt was a deliberate, strategic pursuit of fuel. The animals were undergoing their own physiologic transition, gorging on the final abundance of the forest to build the fat reserves necessary to survive the winter. For the community, this meant the target was no longer just the animal, but the high-quality lipids that the animals had successfully synthesized from the environment. Tracking in this season required a different set of skills, an understanding of animal behavior driven by caloric necessity. The hunters began to look for the signs of the feast. They tracked movements towards specific late seahorses, stands of oaks dropping their final acorns, or clearings where high, protein grasses remained green the longest. Because the animals were intent on feeding, they were often less vigilant than they were in the summer, but their increased fat content made them slower and more predictable in their routes. The hunters used this to their advantage, setting up static observation points near these energy hubs, rather than relying on high-energy, long-distance pursuit. It was a game of patience, waiting for the animals to come to the resource they were desperately seeking. The tracking process itself was aided by the changing landscape. With the leaves gone, the forest floor was a clear can of damp earth and frost-dusted leaves, making reading significant easier. A crushed twig, a tuft of fur caught on a branch, or the specific way the soil was displaced all told a clear story of recent passage. The hunters paid close attention to the depth of hoof or paw print, A deep, heavy impression signaled an animal that had successfully reached its peak autumn weight, making it a priority target. They learned to read the rhythm of the woods, noting how the local scavengers, birds and smaller mammals behaved around a moving herd, providing an auditory map of the animal's progress. This hunt also prioritized the multi-utility harvest. When an animal was taken, it was treated with intense methodical efficiency. The fat, which had been the primary goal of the hunt, was carefully rendered into tallow, a versatile, calorie-dense fuel that could be used for food lighting or as a protective salve for skin and wood. The hide, now at its thickest and most luxurious as the animal prepared for winter, was salvaged with extreme care too. Be processed into the heavy-duty winter gear that would protect the community from the coming sub-zero temperatures. Every element of the kill bone, marrow, hide and meat was integrated in the winter supply chain. For the younger hunters, this period was the final examination of their apprenticeship. They were tasked with the strenuous work of field dressing and the long, heavy hauls back to camp. This was not just manual labour, it was a lesson in the weight of survival. Seeing the raw, physical accumulation of fat on an animal provide a visceral understanding of how energy moved through the ecosystem and into their own bodies. By the time the snow began to stick to the ground, the hunters had secured the final, essential reserves of protein and lipid that would sustain the tribe during the leanest months. They had successfully leveraged the cycle of the animal's growth to ensure the survival of their own. The return to the wintering grounds was a migration defined by gravity and urgency. Unlike the spring ascent, which was fueled by the anticipation of abundance and the freedom of discovery, the autumn descent was a calculated retreat. The high-altitude camps, once vibrant hubs of summer activity, were stripped down to their essential components. The airy summer lodges were disassembled, the precious caches were secured, and the community consolidated their belongings for the journey back to the river valley. The air had turned thin and brittle, and the first warning flurries of snow served as a non-negotiable deadline. They had to be off the high ridges before the passes were choked with impassable drifts. This required a high level of logistical precision. The community was now burdened with the full weight of their summer labour, bundles of dried berries, heavy rolls of cured hides, and sealed containers of rendered fat. They transitioned back to using the load-bearing infrastructure they had engineered earlier in the year. The packing order was vital, critical items, the heavy-duty winter gear, and the most calorie-dense. Food were placed in the most secure, waterproofed packs, carried by those with the highest endurance. The descent was often more physically taxing than the ascent, as they had to navigate steep, slippery slopes while burdened with the winter's accumulated wealth. Navigation shifted from exploring to guiding. They moved along established, well-trodden corridors that avoided the exposed wind, scored ridges. The elders led the way, relying on their internal compasses and the seasonal landmarks they had memorized over decades. They moved with a disciplined, steady rhythm, prioritizing the maintenance of their physical condition over speed. They knew that if a member of the group were to suffer an injury, a twisted ankle or a strained knee, it could jeopardize the safety of the entire unit. They were a single cohesive organism, moving in lockstep through a landscape that was rapidly hardening into ice. Psychologically, this was a moment of profound closure. As they descended in the valley, the transition was literal. They were moving from the world of the open, back in the world of the enclosed. The valley offered protection from the worst of the mountain gales, but it also signified the beginning of the period of relative confinement. The shift in mood was palpable. The playfulness of the summer was replaced by a somber, focused intensity. They were coming home, not for rest, but for the most challenging test of the year. The return journey was a final collective act of commitment, an unspoken agreement that they were ready to face the long, dark stretch ahead as one. Upon reaching the winter site, the final reclamation began. The long houses, which had been left in a state of semi-maintenance, were immediately inspected for damage. The community worked in a frenzy of organized activity to reseal the roofs, clear the perimeter, and establish their hearths. By the time the first sustained snowstorm finally settled over the valley, they were inside, the fires were lit, and the caches were under their immediate watch. The great migration back was complete. They had successfully moved their entire world from the Carrier Highlands to the safety of their ancestral valley, securing the community's future in the face of the encroaching winter. As the sun reached its lowest arc across the southern horizon, casting long bruised shadows over the frozen valley, the community entered the period of the great stillness. The winter solstice was the psychological and spiritual anchor of their year. It was not merely a time to acknowledge the shortest day, it was an act of profound defiance against the encroaching darkness. Having spent the week since their return successfully securing their hearths and stores, the tribe converged for a ritualized gathering that served to reaffirm their collective identity and their promise of continuity. The hearth, usually the function center of domestic life, was transformed in the focus of ceremony. The community gathered in the largest longhouse, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and the rich, savory aroma of slow, simmered bone broth. This was not a feast excess, but a measured communion. They shared the most precious of their preserved stores, the pemmican saved specifically for this date, and the final portions of dried forest fruits as a gesture of gratitude to the land that had provided. This act of controlled consumption was a reminder that their survival was a cycle, and that even in the depth of winter, they were assuming the bounty of the seasons past to fuel their journey towards the future. The ritual was marked by the keating of the light. They understood that the fire was their literal and metaphorical link to life, and throughout the night of the solstice, they engaged in a rotating watch to ensure the central flame never faltered. This was a shared burden. Every family head, every elder, and every apprentice took a turn at the fire. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackle of the wood and the hushed, rhythmic chanting of the elders who recounted the stories of the return, narratives designed to remind the younger generation that the sun had always returned, that the cold had always retreated, and that their ancestors had endured the same darkness for countless generations. This gathering functioned as a critical psychological reset. The isolation of winter living, while physically safe, could be mentally corrosive. The solstice celebration served to break that isolation, reconnecting individuals to the group and grounding them in their shared purpose. By standing together in the firelight, the tribe members saw the reality of their resilience, a group of people who had not only survived but had maintained their structure, their health, and their traditions in the face of nature's most extreme test. It was a reaffirmation of their pact with one another. As the morn of the day following the solstice arrived, the change was barely perceptible. A fraction of a minute more of light, but to the community, it was everything. The elders observed the first hint of the sun's shifting angle with a sense of triumph. The solstice marked the turning of the tide. The community emerged from the longhouse in the biting air with a renewed sense of vigour. They had passed the pivot point of the year. The darkness had tried to consume them, and they had stood firm. They returned to their daily rhythms of maintenance and endurance, now buoyed by the quiet, unshakable knowledge that the cycle was moving once again toward the light. Following the brief high-energy surge of the solstice, the community settled in the deepest phase of the year, the art of silent endurance. This was the dead winter, a time when the external world was locked in a crystalline, frozen state. And the primary challenge was no longer the hunt or the harvest, but the management of one's own psyche. Silence was not merely an absence of sound, it was an active survival strategy. The tribe understood that in the confined energy, scarce environment of a winter longhouse, discord, frustration, or impulsive behaviour were luxuries they could not afford. Endurance was cultivated through a rigorous, almost meditative routine. Every daily task was stripped to its most efficient form. Wood had to be gathered from the nearest stacks, water had to be chipped from the frozen river, and the hearth had to be tended with absolute consistency. These chores were performed with a slow, deliberate cadence, a conservation of motion. By eliminating wasted movement, they preserved their caloric energy and reduced the environmental stress on their bodies. This rhythmic labour was the foundation of their mental stability. It provided a sense of predictability and purpose in a world where the landscape offered none. The social dynamics of the longhouse were governed by a culture of low-impact interaction. Conversations were quiet and purposeful. Storytelling, which in the autumn had been boisterous and instructional, now became subtle, reflective, and often whispered. They practiced a form of deep empathy because everyone was experiencing the same physical constraints. There was an unspoken expectation of mutual support. If a member of the group felt the weight of the cabin fever or the gloom of the shadows, the others would naturally compensate, taking on a heavier share of. The indoor chores were providing small morale, boosting gestures, the sharing of a warmer spot near the fire, or the simple act of listening without judgment. Intellectual endurance was maintained through the relearning of their collective history. Elders spent the long, dim hours teaching the younger generation the intricate details of the tribe's lore, not just the grand myths, but the minute practical observations of the land. They would describe the subtle shifts in the wind that predicted a storm, the specific way a certain tree branch bent under heavy snow, or the exact smell of the forest just before a thaw. This was a mental exercise that kept the mind sharp and focused on the future. They were not just killing time, they were mentally rehearsing their roles for the coming spring, keeping their connection to the land alive within the sanctuary of the winter walls. This state of silent endurance was the ultimate test of their civilization. It was in these dark, cramped months that true strength of their community was forged. They weren't just surviving the cold, they were mastering the internal environment. By choosing patience over anxiety and cooperation over competition, they turned their winter home into a space of intellectual and emotional growth. When the air finally began to warm and the first signs of the thaw appeared, they would not be emerging as weary, broken survivors, but as a group that had deepened their bonds and refined their collective wisdom. They had turned the silence of winter into a source of immense, quiet strength. As the winter's grip began to loosen, marked by the softening of the ice on the riverbanks and the first damp, earthy smells rising from beneath the melting snow, the community underwent a subtle but vital transformation, the passing of the torch. This was the season of leadership transition. The elders, having guided the tribe through the rigours of the deep winter with their seasoned judgment, began the formal process of transferring authority and responsibility to the younger generation. It was a recognition that while the wisdom of the past was the bedrock of survival, the physical demands of the coming spring, the energy, agility, and fresh perspective of the youth. This transition was not a sudden abdication, but a deliberate, phased process of mentorship. Throughout the darkest months, the elders had been observing the younger hunters and gatherers, noting who demonstrated the most composure under stress, who possessed the most intuitive grasp of the landscape's signals, and who best exemplified the spirit of collective care. Now, in the final weeks of the thaw, these individuals were brought into the inner circle. The elders shifted from being the directors of labour to the architects of strategy, placing the burden of execution on the shoulders of their successors. The passing of the torch manifested in the delegation of high-stakes responsibilities. The younger leaders were tasked with planning the first spring excursions, scouting the river for signs of the fish run, assessing the stability of the mountain passes for the upcoming migration, and determining the optimal time to move from the winter longhouses to the temporary spring shelters. They were given the map of memory, an oral inheritance consisting of the granular details of the landscape, which streams would flood first, where the earliest edel shoots would emerge, and which areas were currently compromised by late winter rock slides. This period was also a time for the younger generation to synthesize their own innovations with the established practices. They weren't just expected to copy their predecessors, they were challenged to adapt their survival tactics to the subtle changes in the environment they had observed during their own tenure. The elders encouraged this, understanding that the survival of the tribe relied on the ability to evolve. If the game migration patterns had shifted, or if a particular forest grove had been depleted, the new leaders were expected to identify these trends and adjust their strategies accordingly. It was an intellectual evolution, where the core values of the tribe remained constant, but the methods were refined in real time. For the younger members, this transition was a profound rite of passage. It was the moment they ceased to be participant in the tribal effort and became its primary stakeholders. The weight of this responsibility was balanced by the collective support of the entire community, who understood that their lives depend on the decisions of these new leaders. By the time the first true spring growth blanketed the valley, the transition was complete. The elders transitioned into their role as the keepers of tradition, providing the wisdom of experience, while the new leaders stepped forward with the vigour to steer the tribe into the next cycle. It was a beautiful, functional circle, a society that constantly renewed its strength by trusting its future to the hands that were most capable of shaping it. The cycle's completion was not merely a date on a calendar, it was a state of total, holistic alignment. As the final vestiges of winter frost vanished and the forest floor erupted in a vibrant, verdant display of new life, the community stood at the threshold of the new year. They had successfully navigated the entire oscillation of the seasons, from the initial abundance of the spring forage, through the technical precision of the summer harvest, the intense discipline of the autumn accumulation, and the endurance of the deep winter cold. They had emerged from the longhouse not as individuals, but as a refined, tested, and perfectly synchronized collective unit. This moment of completion was marked by a profound sense of institutional knowledge. They were now intimately familiar with every variation of the landscape they inhabited. They knew the behavior of the river during the spring melt, the specific timing of the forest's regrowth, and the exact capacity of their storage systems. This was not abstract data. It was lived experience that had been etched into the social fabric of the group. The mistakes of the previous year, a cache that had been too shallow, a trail that had been too exposed, had been identified and corrected. They had effectively optimized their existence, narrowing the margin of error until their survival was no longer a question of luck, but a matter of technical certainty. The cycle's completion also solidified the identity of the tribe. By successfully traversing the full circle, they had proven to them that they were masters of their environment. They were no longer at the mercy of the seasonal shifts. They were the conductors of their own survival. This realization brought a profound sense of psychological liberation. The fear of the unknown future that usually plagues human societies had been replaced by a rational confidence in their ability to adapt and prepare. They knew that whatever the next year might bring, a drought, a harsher winter, a change in game patterns, they possessed the tools, the knowledge, and the community cohesion to navigate it. This final phase was a time of cleansing and resetting. The longhouses were deep cleaned and stripped of the accumulated debris of the winter. Tools were repaired, sharpened, and oiled, and the internal social hierarchy was formally recalibrated. They took stock of their remaining resource, the last of the smoked meat, the final handfuls of dried roots, and redistributed them to those who had contributed the most to the community's welfare during the lean months. It was an egalitarian rebalancing, ensuring that the entire group entered the new season on equal footing. As they looked out over the budding landscape, they saw it through the eyes of experts. They recognized the potential of every patch of soil, the path of every stream, and the movement of every animal as parts of a grand interconnected system. The completion of the cycle had transformed them from transient inhabitants of the land into its stewards. They were an inseparable part of the forest, moving with the same rhythm, reacting with the same intelligence, and sustaining them with the same resilience as the ecosystem they called home. They were ready to begin again, not because they had to, but because they had finally learned how to truly inhabit their world. The final legacy of the tribe was not found in the tools they left behind, the stone foundations of their winter homes, or the patterns of their migration, but in the enduring architecture of their culture. By successfully bridging the divide between the erratic demands of the wilderness and the stability of their social structure, they had created a blueprint for human resilience. They demonstrated that the most sophisticated technology a society can possess is not an object, but a process, a way of relating to the environment and to one another that transforms the survival of the fittest into the survival of the most collaborative. This legacy was built upon the fundamental realization that human endurance is a collective project. They had learned that the individual was only as secure as the weakest member of the group, and that the long-term viability of their people depended on the health of the entire social fabric. Every act of storage, every shared meal during the solstice, and every moment of silent endurance in the depth of winter was an investment in a shared future. They understood that their greatest strength lay in their ability to pass on the granular details of their experience, ensuring that the lesson learned from one harsh winter would prevent the suffering of the next. Their resilience was ultimately a testament to the power of deliberate living. They had replaced the chaos of reactive survival with the elegance of anticipatory wisdom. They did not wait for the seasons to dictate their reality. They synchronized their lives to the pulse of the earth, turning the cycle of the year into predictable, manageable, and even beautiful rhythm. This was their greatest gift to the generations that followed, the knowledge that nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a system to be understood, respected, and partnered with. They had proven that a society grounded in such understanding could thrive in conditions that would break others. As the cycle began to turn once more, the community stood as a testament to the fact that persistence is an art form. Their resilience was quiet, steady, and woven into the very fabric of their daily actions. They were no longer just a group of people living in the forest. They were a civilization in harmony with the laws of life. Their history, the stories of the Great Migration, the precision of the smoke, curing rituals, and the deep stillness of the winter solstice, would remain the bedrock of their identity, a guiding light for every individual who would eventually step into the rhythm of the tribe. This was their enduring legacy, the quiet, unshakable truth that while the world may change, the seasons may turn, and the shadows may lengthen, the capacity to prepare, to endure, and to evolve is the defining characteristic of the human experience. They had left behind a world that was richer because they had inhabited it, and a people who were stronger because they had learned, together, how to hold the light through the darkness. The cycle was complete, but in the way of all living things, it was also merely the beginning of the next, even more resilient chapter. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.